You mentioned floods. And speaking of stories that have been lost and found, you're well known for a lot of things. One of them is decoding the so-called Ark tablet.
Yeah, that was a challenge because it's really hard to read.
You got to tell me the story. This ancient Babylonian clay tablet dating 1700 BC, which contains a flood narrative that predates the biblical story of Noah by 1,000 years.
At least.
At least.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you got to tell me the full story.
So the full story is like this. Visitors used to come to the museum to ask questions of the experts who work there, and one would be on duty periodically. And sometimes people would bring objects, sometimes they'd ask questions. And somebody once came in with a whole load of objects, including this tablet, which, to cut a long story short, I identified pretty much straight away as being part of the flood story. It was a tablet about 8 inches by 3. Not the whole flood story, which is the complex narrative, which ended up in the Gilgamesh narrative much, much later. But this one was an early narrative in which the point was taken up where the gods in heaven had decided that the population of Mesopotamia needed to be wiped out because they were so noisy. Mm-hmm. This was the expression. And the gods couldn't sleep after lunch, sort of thing. So they decided they would wipe them out and create something quieter that worked harder. So this was the basic mechanism, and they had different ways of doing it. And then the most effective one was they were going to send a flood to wipe them all out. And one of the gods, the number 3 in the triumvirate, thought this was a deplorable idea, so he took it upon himself to warn this person called Atrahasis, who lived in Mesopotamia, to build a boat to rescue life when the waters came. And in it, he told him the shape of it and the materials he would need and how much he would need of the materials so he could do it safely. And in the 60 lines of the tablet, all this stuff was there. It was like a blueprint to build this boat. And it was extraordinary because it was round, the boat. And everybody who knew their Bible, the Ark's sort of coffin shape kind of affair, and nobody thought of it being a round boat. And the fact is that round boats were used in Mesopotamia on the rivers, coracles, that's to say, because for transporting things, and they would never sink. They were very appropriate. And so in this story, it was decided it was going to be a giant coracle, a really, really big one that would never sink, and the male and female animals could go in, and Atrahasis' wife and his 3 sons and so forth could go in, and everything would be there, and it would float on the water. And when it came down, they said, we'll start all over again. So it's got very many points in common with the description of the flood in Genesis. And of course, so did the one in Gilgamesh. So in 1872, there was an Assyriologist in the British Museum called George Smith. And he was a very, very talented reader. And in 1872, he discovered that one of the tablets from the Nineveh library we were talking about before had on it a passage which ran in parallel with Gilgamesh about the waters coming and the boat and everybody floating, and even to the point that when the rain stopped and the ark came to rest on a mountain, that the hero of this thing in Gilgamesh, who was called Utnapishtim, released a bird 3 times to see whether the trees had come up. And the first one came back, and the second one and the third one didn't, so he knew that. So this was not only in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it was also in the book of Genesis. So what it meant was that you couldn't have 2 stories. It wasn't 2 stories about the same thing. It was literary dependence. It was literary dependence. The one was locked into the other. The text of the Hebrew Bible, from whenever it was written down, of course, nobody knows quite when, but whenever it was about the same time as the one from Nineveh, about the 7th century, 6th century, something like that. The time interval between the Gilgamesh version from Nineveh and the Hebrew Bible is not like a big expanse of time. So there was an argument that one goes this way and one goes that way. But then when this tablet came in 1,000 years older, nobody believes the Bible was written in 1700 BC. So the primacy of the Mesopotamian matter was established. And it's important because you never get floods in Jerusalem. You just don't. But in Mesopotamia, they had floods. The rivers, sometimes there wasn't enough water, sometimes there was too much, sometimes there was far too much water. So the mechanism that the waters could be used as a destructive force by the powers that be is a plausible Mesopotamian mechanism. And it's based in a sort of sense, in my opinion, in reality. I think there must have been some tsunami once. Most people were drowned, and those who survived were in boats, obviously, and then afterwards nobody ever forgot it, and it went on and on
So you
and
mean
on.
there actually could have been a catastrophic event of a
Yeah,
large
not
scale?
the whole world, because people,
But just enough to imagine.
yeah, sweeping down to the Persian Gulf, and the flat plains, everything would be destroyed, all the houses would be destroyed, animals would be drowned. And
This is an incredible discovery. Do you think it's possible that this is the original? There are flood myths in many cultures.
I believe this. The Mesopotamians had a deep-seated horror of dependency on water when they couldn't control it. They were fearful of it. And they had a rainbow in Babylonia, like in the Bible, as a proof that the disastrous flood would never happen again. But I think there must have been one episode of this kind, maybe 5,000 years before the tablet, 10,000, it doesn't matter, because with the passage of time, nothing happens in that part of the world. So something will be alive, grandfather to grandson, before you go to sleep. And remember, my boy, you only have to be careful, because otherwise, and all that stuff, for sure, bogeyman stuff, it never quite died out in their conscious minds. So I think that when the Judeans from Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple and by the Babylonians and the rout of the priesthood and everything, the king and the others went overland to Babylon as refugees, and they had to live there for 3 generations of time under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So I believe that the text of the Bible was written then, because if you read the Bible attentively, which I can't say I do on a regular basis, but if you do read it dispassionately, you have the mechanism that the early books of the Bible explain to the reader how it is that these people are in such a mess, because they're supposed to be the chosen people doing all that. Look they haven't got a temple, they haven't got a country, they're washed up and everything like that. So I think that what happened was it's a complex thing, but the Judeans from Jerusalem, they spoke Hebrew, but they also spoke Aramaic, right? The 2 languages, their sister languages. And the Babylonians spoke Babylonian, and they also spoke Aramaic. And they all wore the same kind of clothes, and they all had brown skin. And when all these refugees from Jerusalem were milling around in Babylonia, they would have intermarried and disappeared within no time at all. And the authorities who were there prevented this by drawing up a kind of charter of their history, explaining things from the beginning of time up until now, how it happened and what happened, and it was all intentional. So that is, in my opinion, the driving force behind the Hebrew text. And the thing about it is that they didn't have, in Jewish philosophical tradition, stuff about creation and the beginning of the world. And they took Babylonian ideas, which they learnt when they were there, and they recycled them. So whereas the Babylonians decided that the gods were going to wipe out the noisy persons, when the Jewish philosophers got this narrative to recycle about the vengeful Almighty, he was in the Old Testament a very unpleasant and vengeful person, it was because of sin. It wasn't because of racket and playing the radio. It was sin. So they took one narrative and they recycled it for their own purposes.
The flood is a useful tool to punish people for whatever X is.
That's exactly right. And something else is this, right? You have 5 days to build the ark, or whatever it is, or 2 weeks to build the ark. So the clock goes tick, 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 tick. And about a third of the films that come out of Hollywood are the world's going to be demolished by aliens, and you've got 24 hours to think of a cure, tick, 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 tick. So that narrative is irresistible, that one man can save the world, if he's lucky, in time, from disaster. So it starts off with Utnapishtim, and it goes on to Noah, and then it goes on to Hollywood.
Do you think this ark in the tablet actually was ever built? You did build a replica 1/3 the size.
Yeah.
And you people should check out. You tell the story of that wonderfully. What did you learn from building this replica, and do you think the actual ark existed?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a literary construction out of the reality that people who did survive were on boats. I mean, they had boats for sure. And you might wake up in the Persian Gulf and you never know what happened. But, it's a literary, moral principle teaching narrative. And look, missionaries take it all around the world. That's the other thing. See, this is the mystery of it, that you have flood stories everywhere, and some of them are from meddlesome missionaries who have all these innocent little kids sitting on benches, and I'm going to tell you a story, like that. So it moves into this consciousness, and it gets recycled, and it gets recycled. So this is one thing. And then also there probably are spontaneous ideas, because it's not so complicated or so amazing that independently people would have such a narrative. After all, like the great river in China floods and everybody gets... So that's not at all surprising. But what was so shocking for George Smith, who was such a clever person, is to read for the first time on this tablet from Nineveh, long before the one that I discovered came to light, about the 3 birds being released, one after the other. And that was the clincher, that the 2 stories were locked together. And lots of clergymen got very miserable about it and didn't know what to make of it.
So that's a definitive proof that there's a
literary link. I think so.
And I mean, these puzzles that are then connected, but the ark, you discover 1,000 years. So that means that story of the flood has been told many, many times across that span to, do your homework or the flood is going to come.
That's right.
To all the
That's right. And every time somebody built a coracle and they didn't do the waterproofing right,
yeah,
what will happen? It'll be out on the river, and that will be your lot. I think so. I think it was there's a certain amount of evidence that in Mesopotamian society, people talk about the time before the flood and after the flood. And it's like when I was a boy, people used to talk about before the war, we used to, and now we do this. It's a kind of cataclysmic cut across history, which provides a ruler, so things are either before it or after it. Because there's a king list, for example, where they wrote down the names of all the kings, all the way back to the beginning, including kings before the flood. They knew about that. They have their names and their great regnal years or thousands of years. Fascinating.
So there's a guy named Graham Hancock who talks about the Younger Dryas hypothesis, 10,000 BC, that there was an asteroid that hit Earth and melted the ice sheets, and that created a flood in North America. So that means an actual cataclysmic global event that then, as all the different civilizations sprung up, they all carried that knowledge, that memory. That's his idea. What probability would you assign to that?
I would say negligible, because I regard it as a literary matter, which is not predicated on the existence of flood in people's minds. But I do believe that the story in Mesopotamia owes its inception to a disastrous flood, but nothing global, nothing that touched America or China or Birmingham. So I don't have any sympathy with that. But people have drilled cores and in the I don't know, all over. I'm not interested in all that stuff. It's, to my mind, it's a literary topos of great potency, of irresistible potency, because everybody identifies with the idea of being in bed and someone knocks on the door and says, get up, you've got to build a boat and this is what you're going to need and you've got to get on with it, sunshine, or we're all sunk. I mean, what are you going to do? The most interesting thing is that this Atrahasis in the 1700 text, he wasn't a king and he wasn't a sailor or a boat builder. So how comes this clever god who wants to find someone to build? Wouldn't you go for look in the yellow pages for a boat building company and say, listen, fellas, I've got a deal. No, he had to tell him, this is the blueprint, this is the shape, you need all this, you need all that, you've got to measure it and all that. It's a very interesting thing.
I mean, yeah, that's a great story. You don't go to the great boat builder. You go
Taxi driver or
to the
something like
taxi, and then that's that hero's journey. That's the stuff of great myths. Yeah,
that. It is a great myth.
a little detail would be really cool about the replica. Like, what did you of the boat? Yeah, 1/3
that
replica.
was something else. There were three blokes who did it.
Yep.
And they were specialists in reconstructing medieval Arab boats because quite often they'd found in the mud or bits, or they have information, and so they were at home in it. And we built it on a small lagoon in Kerala. It was just the most unbelievably wonderful thing because they used the instructions as a blueprint. They made it about 1/3 of the size of the original, a pretty huge thing, but they made it because it had wooden ribs, you see, and they could get wooden ribs. They worked out by computer the maximum size they could do it when it would work. Beyond it, it would be impossible because once they built the curved ribs and then the stuff woven all around it, it had to be covered in bitumen, which is also very heavy, to make it waterproof. So they calculated the size and it worked. So they built this thing on rollers and it was pushed out it was just the most unbelievable. I went out there with my dear wife for the last few days and was on the maiden voyage, and they had trouble with the bitumen because Indian bitumen is really not up to scratch. And they couldn't get Iraqi bitumen because it's cultural property, it's carcinogenic. They wouldn't export a tanker load of Iraqis, so we had to use Indian stuff. But the thing is this, the bitumen which they coated it with, it was okay, but it wasn't perfect. So when it went out into the waters, there was a bit of a leak. Water had to be bailed out. So I was, you see, I said, okay, listen, sunshine, I said to this producer, you ever been in a rowing boat without water in the bottom? Excuse me.
Oh, you're saying that's a feature, not a bug.
That's the feature of the thing. Yeah, that's the feature. That thing could have gone to Portsmouth.
So it's authentic.
Absolutely right. We had such an adventure with that thing. They made a documentary film.
Yeah.
In various languages. And you know what they did? I was in it a bit. And they had people saying, I don't think it was this, I don't think it was that, and they didn't let me go back and say, what the hell are you talking about? I did it, I know what I'm talking about. I can read cuneiform, can you? They didn't do it. I couldn't get my own back. I was really annoyed, really furious.
So you're saying that there's some inaccurate things too.
I am saying there's some inaccurate things. Yeah, somebody in Iraq said, it couldn't have been that. They probably had lots of little coracles all tied together. Did they fuck? I mean, he couldn't read the stuff. I mean, it's really, really, really annoying. I mean, you should have a chance, shouldn't you? If you're going to have a fencing match, you both have to have a rapier, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and you're the OG. You're the person that
I can read
decoded it.
Yeah. But the thing is this, the proportions of the material were accurate. This is the crucial thing. That what had happened is they took the information about how you make a real coracle, which is usually enough 2 people and a few sheep and goats, and they bumped them up so that it worked. And I know why that is. Because it goes back to your question about oral literature, because there must have been times when people went to villages and told them about the flood. And when they got to the question of the boat, they'd say something like this. And Enki said, you've got to build the biggest coracle you've ever seen, like that. Right? Well, I mean, if you do this in a cinema in Guildford, people will say, well, that's fine. But if you do it to a whole load of river people who use coracles and they're not going to take that. They're not going to say, how big was it then? Come on, how big was it? So what do? They go to a coracle place and they work out the proportions of material, and then they bump it up so that the actor who reads this for the first few times, he has in his pocket how much it is, but after a while he knows it by heart, so that none of these people get angry. You can't expect us big enough for all this. So then he'd have all the stuff, and he'd do it with this way, and you need all this, and need all this, and they'd all be hypnotized by it. That, I think, it's actually regarding your question, it's on the cusp of purely oral literature to purely literary literature. It's actually there because you can see that it was molded in the environment when people were still talking.
Yeah, you got to make it authentic to really connect with people.
Well, you couldn't pull it wool over their eyes. I mean,
Well, I wish many of the films in Hollywood today would have the same level of rigor.
Rigor is one of the things lacking in the world.
By the way, I forgot to ask, why was the flood myth focused on noisy people?
Well, it can't really be noisy. I tell you what the explanation is. It's something quite different. Before the flood, the gods had not created death. So I think the noise was a reflex of the fact there were just too many animals, too many people, and they had to do something about it. So it's a sort of euphemism, so to speak, because after the flood, at the end of the tablet, not my tablet, but the other ones, where it's still broken, it says there's a tantalizing thing where they create barren women and who can't have children and men who can't have children and people who priestesses who don't have children, and they institute in society some figures who will not reproduce the species. So it's actually a rather sophisticated Malthusian kind of philosophical position. It's remarkable. So that the noise means there's so many of them, not that they're actually so noisy that we can't hear ourselves think.